is focused on these interactions and the belief that in order to explain ROI and how advertising works and how the different platforms work, you really have to step back a little bit and look at the precursors of sales and look at how consumers react to the ad, and then focused on the multi-platform campaigns. How does this all work together? So we were using neuroscience to investigate how each medium builds brands in the brain, what the cross-platform synergy and priming effects are, and then we also took a look at the difference between so-called digital natives and regular people to see whether the digital natives really are from a different planet and whether their brains really work in a very, very different way. So again, why do we study consumers' brains with neuroscience methods? You heard a little bit about all the research that the ARF did and the constantly growing evidence that neuroscience really is able to predict sales. But it's really about the fact that the brain is really the center of ad response and memory and decision making. And this is just so important, that traditional methods don't really give you the whole story because they access mainly the conscious brain. And it's been, if you look at the literature for 20 years or so, theorists and practitioners have talked about the role of emotions in advertising, and that we all kind of suspect that they're really important, but there are really no good measures to really assess emotions in a quantifiable, reliable manner. And finally, this sort of dream has come true, and we have arrived at that. And we now have the evidence that adding neuroscience to the research really does give you better insights into these precursors of sales. So a year ago or so, after we met with a lot of industry leaders and devised this research plan, this is what we came up with, and what you're hearing today is a result of all of that. We started out with a meta review and synthesis, building on 80 years of research on how advertising works and especially why it works. Looked at over 200 studies. I'm afraid one of my cabinets at home is going to collapse under the weight of all of this stuff. But then we really focused on the new learnings, and we looked particularly at the most recent studies done during the last 5 years to see what we could find out about how advertising works today and which ways it might be working differently. And that included about 50 neuro studies. And as I just told you, we really paid a lot of attention to those because our whole strategy was, very much like the semi-academic that I am, to look for confirmation, corroboration. We looked at different research studies, different methodologies to see where are the common findings. So we could say, look, there are all these different studies looking at this issue, different methods, different samples, but they all find the same thing. So we can really be sure that we have something here. That's what we were looking for. And we're also very, very thankful for a lot of sponsors, a lot of ARF members that generously have shared research with us, had conversation with us, sometimes about proprietary stuff, just to kind of help us really understand what the most recent research on these issues is. And then finally, again, thanks to generous donations from our sponsors, we were able to do 2 original research experiments, which were conducted by Media Science and NeuroInsight, who are both represented here. And in addition to that, one of the sponsors, Nielsen Neuro, did a meta-analysis of all of their work and sort of summarized all their insights. And again, that really contributed to our insights. So as you heard Manuel this morning, all of this, to make it simple and memorable, was summarized in these two calls for action. Looking at what the industry does today and comparing it, what the research says, what the strategy should be, we found, again, strong confirmation about the importance of creative, and that coordinated creative strategies across platforms is really, really important in order to benefit from synergy effects, priming effects, and all of that. And then secondly, you need to customize the creative to each platform to amplify engagement by adapting to the platform. And if you were here for the presentation that we just heard from Peter from NeuroInsight in Melbourne, they've done research in Australia which totally confirms that. And they showed how, in this case, a TV promo had to be adapted to the various platforms in order to really be as effective as possible. So, with that little introduction, I would like to hand it over to Manuel, who's going to introduce our esteemed panel of neuro experts.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. So please join me in welcoming three of our partners in making the baby. Dr. Carl Marcy, Chief Neuroscientist of Nielsen Consumer Neuroscience, Duane Varan, CEO of Media Science, and Pranav Yadav, CEO of NeuroInsights in the US. Thank you so much for joining. So first of all, it's been an amazing pleasure to work with these three gentlemen and their teams. It's been great. So what I wanted to do today, it's a little bit in 1-2 minutes each, is to dig a little bit deeper in what we did in this huge and simplified ground truth experiment. So I would like to start with Duane to tell us a little bit more of what we did with them in the study to show how advertising across platforms is more effective than advertising in a single platform.
So we actually did this study in 2 different stages. The first stage was actually somewhat of a disaster, so we had to redo the whole study. And the reason it was a disaster was because when we started, we wanted to measure across all platforms. So there was, I guess you could say, a little bit of pressure, of wanting to make sure that all constituents were satisfied. So we looked at radio, print, mobile, et cetera. And the problem was that there were too many platforms, particularly for the design. And so we actually subjected our poor subjects to having to experience all of the platforms. And then when we looked at the data, we realized that there was just way too much artifact because it was just such difficult, particularly because between each experience, people had to get recalibrated. So we then reduced it to what we had done in our studies historically, going back to 2005, where we only had 2 platforms. And so the 2 platforms that were selected were mobile and TV. And we tested a number of different questions. We tested sequence, so TV first versus mobile first, reversing the order. And then we also, of course, tested to see what happened when you had TV and mobile, what happened when you had TV. And then mobile had there were 2 different types of mobile experiences. There was mobile video, and then there was also mobile display. So there was a lot happening in that mix. What we found is that I'm really glad that we had the TV, because if you didn't have the TV, of course, more exposures would have just translated to higher impact. And you wouldn't have been able to assert that was actually a cross-platform effect. It would have just been a frequency kind of effect. But what we were able to demonstrate was that the combination did, in fact, have a higher impact across a number of measures, the most important of which were really around memory. One of the things that I also want to emphasize in this, which was really interesting with the biometrics, was there were differences with the biometrics, and particularly they were related to the fact that the content across the experiences were different, the mobile versus the TV. So when it was TV, it was a traditional show. There was a huge content transfer effect that was at work there, which provided a little bit of a boost in the biometric experience. So experienced differently, and the way that the platforms worked were experienced in different ways, but the overall impact was actually very similar.
Thank you. So one of the things we saw is that for that kicker effect to happen, the campaigns needs to be coordinated and under the same creative strategy, as I was mentioning this morning, and Horst was mentioning now. So we did part of that study with NeuroInsight, with Pranav, first on TV and then on radio. So could you tell us a little more about what we did and what we found in that study?
Sure. So if you were in this room before this presentation, you would have seen Peter from our Australia office present how they took a piece of creative from TV, made it multi-screen ready. If you are going to be in the room after, you're going to see me and Facebook looking at how TV primes Facebook, Facebook primes TV. So obviously, this is a topic that we're really interested in. In this specific study, we looked at how TV primes radio and TV primes print, but looking at specific campaigns split into either core campaigns for the brand or line extensions for the brand, and looking at these differences and similarities between these creatives and figuring out, is there a strategy that works really well? And what we found was when similar aspects of the creative are taken from one platform to another, it increases memorability when you see it on the second platform. So in this graph that you see over here, we have 4 cases. And in the first 2 cases, these were campaigns that you saw on TV for a core brand. And then you heard about the same brand on radio, but a completely different campaign altogether. And we saw that the memorability actually decreased when you followed it up with radio. But when you actually took aspects of the TV campaign and then put them on radio, using similar kind of narrative or similar messaging, that's when we saw like a lift in memory encoding as you moved from one platform to the other. So that's what we found.
Thank you. And then from the multiple amazing insights we got from our good friends from Nielsen Consumer Neuroscience, there's like this one, the snapback effect that was very impactful to the audience in many of the different scenarios when we shared this content. So I would like Dr. Karl Marster to share a little bit more about this study with us.
Sure, happy to. First of all, just to give a little context, so our contribution to this ground truth exercise was to do what we call a meta review, not a meta-analysis. We weren't combining data to analyze it, but we looked across over 24 studies that Interscope had done prior to the acquisition by Nielsen and that Nielsen Neuro had done. And it was really an amazing opportunity to combine lots of different studies from great clients like Viacom and Time Warner and Fox and Ford Motor Company. And you can imagine we had a lot of different insights. I'm going to talk about one. And the one I'm going to talk about we call snapback. And we actually found this by accident. So we were doing some work with Turner, and the idea was we want to understand while people watch TV, the primary screen, and they have a second screen, either a tablet or a smartphone, what were they doing on that second screen? As we were doing that, and how are they engaged, from a biometric and eye tracking perspective. And as we were doing that study, we saw this behavior over and over and over again. And let me describe the behavior. So there's a big screen up there, and then they're holding his hand, and they're looking down, and then they look up, and they look back down, and they look up, and they look back down. And we called that affectionately snapback. And when we decided to do some more research on snapback, and we wanted to understand what were the drivers, what was driving people, A, to look from the second screen to the first screen, and then B, what kept them there. Because you have to realize, even in a controlled environment, people were spending a lot of time looking at that second screen. And this is concerning for advertising. And so what we found isn't necessarily surprising. It's that audio cues take a very primary role in the second screen environment. So people aren't changing channels. They're not walking out of the room. They're in the room. So their head's down. They hear some audio cue, and it brings their eyes back up to that screen. So things like humor, loud noises, changes in music, sometimes the absence of audio got people's attention. But that was only part of the story. So that's part one. Part two is, how do you actually keep them on the second screen? Because more often than not, people would look up, and then they'd look back down. Unless the basic rules of creative were being applied. And so what we see over and over again, and I know my friends here have seen the same thing, is that what drives engagement really are compelling characters who are going on a journey, some part of story. They're overcoming some sort of obstacle, usually being helped by a brand, product, or service that eventually leads to an emotional payoff. And the branding moment occurs at the end. And when ads did that effectively, they were able to not only maintain people's engagement, but also their visual attention. And what was really interesting, and I think this is the most surprising finding, the one advantage of having that second screen is that what drives people to look at the second screen in the first place? It's typically when they're bored or not engaged. And what are they doing on that second screen? Something that's personally relevant to them. So their emotions actually go up a little bit. So when they do look back to that first screen, they're actually in sort of a hyper alert state and a hyper engaged state. So there is an opportunity, and obviously I'm trying to make something that's potentially a negative for advertisers into a positive, but it's the world we're in. And I think we just have to be mindful that as things get more complex and there's a lot of distractions in the world, we have to be smart about how we do our research and how we tell our stories.
Thank you. So there are two elements from this research that we have not been able to address today because we didn't have time. One of them is sequencing, and the other one is differences across generations, digital natives and digital acquirers. So let's focus on the sequencing part. There's one study that the fantastic Fiona Blade's going to be presenting tomorrow from Mesh Experience, and it's a completely different tool and method. But it shows that for large brands, advertising on TV first and then on digital is more effective. But for medium and small brands, digital followed by TV would be more effective. So I would like, and I would ask you to be very, very brief, to get a little bit of your insights on what sequencing should be.
I'll start. One of the studies we contributed to the ARF we did with Fox Television, and we looked at TV advertising plus rich media. So this wasn't video plus video. It was rich media online. And one of the things that we did that I thought was fairly clever was to take brands from outside the U.S., so Canada and the U.K., and launch them, so to speak, to U.S. audiences. And we did the sequencing that you just described. So TV first, followed by rich media followed by TV. And I think very consistent with what's been said, we found that when you start with TV for a brand that's unknown, you do much better than if you don't. Because of the level of engagement compared to rich media, the level of visual attention, the level of emotion that gets generated. And then when it comes to established brands, it was less important what the sequence was. But then again, consistent with what we heard this morning, having campaigns that are built to the platform but are related to each other has the best effect. And I think the neuroscience is very clear that you can really build a model in the brain and a network in the brain by making subtle changes, but yet leveraging assets from one platform like TV, where you can tell a big story, onto a secondary screen.
Yeah, so we have looked at this question a number of times, including in the ground truth experiment that we did for the ARF here. And in our work, we consistently find that TV has to go first for the effect to work. So there is a kicker effect, but the kicker effect was really only present when the sequence was TV first and then digital second. And we think that that makes sense because we think that what TV is doing is, of course, building the awareness of the brand and positioning the brand, and to have the impact of the digital without that kind of framing it. Now, of course, I should emphasize that this is really looking at a scenario where we're talking about print, digital display, et cetera. When you're talking about video, you can't achieve that effect, of course, across platforms, because what we show is that video is video no matter where it's experienced. But really, it's a question about, particularly when you start looking at the sequence of digital display and non-video kind of assets. And that's particularly where the TV first sequence becomes important.
Well, I find the kind of questions kind of funny, because it's like when you're young, people tell you, you ask your parents, what do you want, what do I do to become successful? And if you're Indian, you're told become a doctor or an engineer. And that seems to be the answer to everything. But obviously, it depends on your personality, your ambition, what kind of person you are. Same way, when we're trying to answer this question around sequencing, there's so many other variables. Right? How big is the brand? Do people know it? How much budget do you have behind it? And all of those things. And never can we ever do a study where you can find all brands that are equal, and then all the platforms that you can possibly test. So there's been no conclusive work that at least we've done. Because someone comes to us and says, you want to test this for us on 7 different platforms? The answer is, yes, we can, but do you have the budget for it? Not really. So that's the conclusive answer to this is not something we know. But on one end, we do a lot of work around taking TV, because that's where a lot of money still goes, and taking that creative and optimizing it for different platforms, and we've seen that work really well. In this study, we saw that, again, TV primed radio and magazines really well. The other thing that we see is that there's a congruence effect amongst different platforms. So we've seen things like a TV or a magazine print experience where people seem to be in the same kind of state, sitting at home reading in a relaxed kind of fashion, that TV primes magazine, magazines prime TV really well. And we've seen a similar congruence effects on things such as digital ads on mobile versus outdoor digital, which is, again, things that you see on the move, that you perceive a certain way. So those things prime each other really well. So I don't have an answer for what's the best thing for anybody to do in terms of sequencing, but these are principles that work really well.
So a lot to be said about sequencing and a lot to be researched. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but unfortunately we ran out of time about 4 minutes ago. But anyway, we are all going to be around for the conference, so you can come to any of us and ask us questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Pranav.